Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation or around the world. Once again, you are listening to the VMware Community's Roundtable Podcast. Today is Wednesday. It is, what is today? Wednesday, June 5th, 2019. My name is Eric Nielsen. With me today, I have my co-host, Jonh White. John, how are you doing this week?
Doing really well, Eric. Color of the Bay report this week. It was like that emerald green, which is like it was that green without the muddiness that you see sometimes with a bunch of wind. But it's also really warm. I don't.
It's in the 80s now. Yeah. It's we're getting our money's worth of weather finally.
But also summer. The rain made the blues particularly, shall we say, intense.
Yeah. Whose voice was that?
This is Bill Roth, and on the show today, we're going to talk about risk modeling in the cloud economy with Craig Stanley. Greg is the lead cloud economist. Craig? Got Craig?
Did I say but Greg? I answer to Greg as well.
Yeah, there you go. My son's name is Greg, so that's just a Freudian
There you go.
So Craig Stanley, we've got you on the call today in the room. It's great. We also have Bill Roth. So Craig, you're lead economist at VMware, and Bill is director of cloud economics. Bill, we talked about cloud economics a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, so we're focusing on this subject this week. So we'll get to that show. Happy to have both of you in the studio again. Thanks for coming.
Great to be here.
Happy to be here. Yeah.
Awesome. But before we get to that, we'll do a little bit of the news. What's happening around VMware? Of course, we have VMware key dates as always. Global content catalog opens on 06/18, which is coming up because we're getting there. Today is 06/5, so just 13 more days and the content catalog opens up. You want to kind of know that. They do publish a time and date for that to open, so if you want to get in and get your favorite session at VMworld, there is a time that is broadcast when the content catalog opens up for everyone. So watch that date, 06/18. Early bird registration ends on 06/21. Early bird registration for Europe ends 07/26. Schedule Builder opens on 06/16. That's kind of weird because content catalog, I think I have those dates wrong. That can't be right. Schedule Builder cannot open before content catalog.
That's my understanding of how time works.
Yeah, exactly.
The problem is lots of strange things happen.
Gonna have to go get that fixed.
It could happen.
That's right. So we'll do Schedule Builder opens in Europe on 09/24, and then obviously the conferences is 08/25, and in Europe it's 11/04, and that's the weekly conference update. Ticking down, getting excited about that.
Yeah.
Other things that are going on, Developer Week in New York. Myself, Crippa, and Casey from our team are going to be there for VMware Code. It's a Developer Week conference. If you're going to be there, or if you're in the New York region and you want a free pass to that, I think we have 50 passes. I think we have 45 passes left.
Wow.
So you can reach out to myself or Crippa and tweet at us if you want to. If you're looking to be in that area and want to come down and hang out with us, we're going to be running community activities throughout the week. We have a 20 by 20 booth there with a small studio, giving away Raspberry Pi sensors again. This time we're doing Kubernetes, so we're installing Kubernetes on Raspberry Pis, and we have a little workload that we'll be running and possibly uploading that workload up into PKS on AWS. So kind of a fun week that we're going to be kind of showing people VMware's Kubernetes offering, as well as containers, right, and so forth. So we'll be there in 2 weeks. Come visit us June 17th through the 20th, Brooklyn Exposé Center in New York. Other than that, Corey Romero, what do you got for vExperts? Any updates there?
Yeah, I've got a couple of updates. How you doing, Eric?
I'm doing great. Nice weather.
Awesome. So for sure. So the updates I have this week for vExpert is we have a new sub-program coming next week. I know on my last podcast I said it was going to be this week, but we had a little hiccup. So our projected timeline is next week when Matt Bradford gets back to us. And so it's going to be the vExpert Cloud Management Program. It'll be headed up by Matt Bradford and a few others from the CMBU. The second update I have for vExpert is I sent an email out this morning about call for blogs on VMware webcasts. So there's some detailed information in there in the email I sent this morning, and an email address and instructions on what to do and who to send it to. And the deadline for that is June 19th. So that's all I have for this week.
And so if you guys are out there doing the blogs, are we going to then get those blogs and promote them if they're good blogs on those topics?
Yes.
Is that the idea?
Yep, absolutely. That is one of the line items in. There's actually a whole paragraph on that section about promoting these blogs around social channels. For
Fantastic.
sure.
All right, great. All right, and with that, John, what's up with VMUG and any other news you have?
Yeah. So we have a couple user cons coming up in the U.S. June 6th is the Philadelphia VMUG user con in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. That's a full day, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So if you're not registered and you're in that area, get registered up. If you are in the Southern California area, the June 18th SoCal VMUG user con is coming up. That's in Long Beach, California. Again, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So another full day. If you're in the area, definitely take advantage of those user cons. It's great content, great opportunity.
Great. All right. And with that, we'll get to the main topic of today, which is risk modeling in the cloud with Craig Stanley. Craig, why don't you, and we'll also give Bill a chance, but let's do Craig first. Then we'll do a little bit intro for Bill. I got something special for Bill we'll do. But Craig, tell us who you are. How long have you been at VMware? What do you do? And what did you do before you got to VMware?
Okay. Well, I've been with VMware for almost 8 years now. And I've been involved in a lot of the TCO and modeling activities. Started early on with our VMware Accelerate group, and then also moved over to our professional services engineering team supporting the TAM organization. So I've been doing modeling for quite a number of years. I've also been involved with VM probably longer than most people here. I was doing VM back in 1981. Back before it was cool to be doing VM, so I did VM on mainframe. IBM mainframe,
Yep,
exactly.
Right.
Did that as a systems engineer for a while, and then ended up at Gartner for about 9 years as a research director. Also managed the practices around data center benchmarking, storage benchmarking, so forth. And then made my way to VMware.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. Isn't that the case?
Absolutely. We're always going through the cycle of centralization, decentralization, centralization. I've lost track of how many cycles we've been through now.
Exactly. Okay, and with you, we have Bill Roth. Bill is a regular on our show. So, Bill, we want to absolutely ask you about, what is it, inverted yield curves? So tell us a little bit about who you are in 10 seconds, and then tell us another minute of inverted yield curve.
Got it. So Bill Roth, Director of Cloud Economics. You'll remember me from episode 478.
Nice.
Our discussion about cloud economics generally, a little callback. A fan of the pod.
And I like that you got rid of the suit. I'm feeling more comfortable now.
Exactly.
Hey, everybody on Facebook Live. Thanks a lot for watching us. Always good to see everybody.
Exactly. Oh, that's right. You got split cams.
Yes.
Because this was so let's talk about inverted yield curve. So as an economist, one of the things that we care about is sort of the general overall economy and how people behave. There's basically how people should behave and how they actually behave. And one measure of that in the economy is what's happening in the capital markets. So you look at how people, as they begin to buy bonds at 1, 3, 5, 10, and 30 year, you look at those at the yield. And remember,
right,
for those of you who took your capital markets classes, prices and yields go in opposite directions. Normally what happens is you have a yield curve where your yield is higher on 30 year. However, we're starting to see some sagging, which means that there is, in many cases, folks are sort of betting against the future to some degree. So there's some move in the capital markets.
You get a higher yield on a shorter.
Correct.
On a shorter.
And so that things in 3 year, 5 year, there's a little bit of worry that there might be some contraction in the marketplace. So folks, keep an eye. Nice. There's a lot of volatility out there. Nevertheless, as if you're paying attention to VMware's public earnings, things obviously we
did well.
We did well, and that's about all we're allowed to say on that topic.
And
we did well.
There's only about a week or so that we're after earnings announcement. We're actually even allowed to mention it. So
indeed,
we're in that window. So inverted yield curve, cool. All right.
Yeah. So thanks for having us on. I think one of the key things that, as we talked about in episode 478. on cloud economics, is that what I wanted to talk about is we measure kind of TCO, which is total cost of ownership. If you buy one way, it costs this much. If you buy another way, it costs less. And obviously, I think VMC makes a lot of VMware Cloud on AWS makes a lot of sense for that. But a lot of people just do comparisons of hardware to hardware, bits to bits.
Acquisition cost.
But Craig's done some really innovative work around thinking about risk. So, Craig, tell us about how you think about risk as it relates to IT generally, and then we'll sort of expand from there.
Okay. Yeah, I tend to think about risk all the time, but in a good way. Mm-hmm. Just actually as a follow-on to your point, that's one of the the key drivers of yield is risk. That's what's influenced in what drives the yield, part of what drives the yield. So I began to look at the idea started about 10 years ago when I started working with a different company, different process, really trying to help them develop a model to defend against OpenStack, where how do we compete against getting it free? So
Right.
what's really the true cost of free? So that's really where where I started in the process. And as I got more into it, I started developing understanding the psychology of decision making. And what really drives decisions? What causes us to make one decision versus another decision? And I began to realize as we were going through the process, developing value selling, and so forth, there's really more to it than just product A costs less or more than product B. There's a risk element to that. And part of that was understanding what's the psychology of making decisions. What's the psychology of risk? And basically it comes down to there's three different states that we end up in. And if you work in sales, you work in really anything, you understand there's really three psychological reactions to a risk or to a threat or to a challenge. We've all heard of the fight or flight. Sure. Okay, so fight or flight. There's actually a third one, freeze. Freeze is the do nothing solution. So that's what we started with the process of understanding how do we get around the freeze response. And part of that was due to really understanding what drives risk and understanding that there's a financial part of the risk decision, there's a emotional part of the decision, and understanding how do we define what it is we don't know, which is causing indecision bias.
Okay, there you go. I mean, and so you can kind of see the underpinnings of all this. And so now the thought is, when we look at cloud and we look at decisions people make, whether it's a development environment or whether it's cloud or whether it's an environment to move to, what are you seeing in terms of, and how do you think of risk in these instances?
I think when looking at cloud, initially the largest risk I'm seeing is the most prominent one. I'm sure there's others, suitability of purpose, would obviously be one. But the largest one is lock-in. And I think that's really the biggest issue is understanding if I go with a certain decision, how is this going to affect me? As I mentioned before, there's an emotional aspect. There's a fear associated with making a decision. There's an organizational aspect to it, which is, okay, so what if this takes longer than we planned? What if it costs more than we planned? What if we get locked into a bad solution? Those are all the organizational, emotional responses as part of the decision. But in every decision, there's also a personal one. How does this affect me personally? If I make this bad decision, what happens to me? What happens to my job? And so you have to understand that that's part of the impact as well. So we really want to try to understand the emotional components of the decision. We recognize that there's decisions are driven. I came up with 3 rules of risk, and one is that from the financial side is the size of the stakes drives the emotional response. The second one is that the risk that I'm exposed to has to be less than what I'm willing to tolerate or accept without mitigation. And lastly, the upside potential has to be greater than the downside potential risk of failure. So by looking at these different aspects, we can kind of get a better understanding of how the risk applies and how we relate to that. And kind of going back to what Bill said, the lock-in is a serious risk element, because if we get locked into a decision that's not the right decision or doesn't turn out to be the right decision down the road, okay, how do we get out of that? Do we have a way out?
that's like maybe this is a subtle differentiation, but it sounds like there's two different aspects of that. One is the project risk. What if it doesn't work out as well as we think it does? And then there's the opportunity cost, which is what if we make this decision and we miss out on a better decision in the future? So it could be okay, but what if something is great, but we've already started down this okay path?
Absolutely, and part of that is where you end up with freeze is because of I've known some people that had what we called analysis paralysis, meaning they could never make a decision because tomorrow they would have more information.
Right.
So they always put off the decision one more day, because there's more information coming in. Mm-hmm. And so that's really how we started getting into some of the science of deciding, how do you make decisions. One of the ones I like is that how the size of the stakes drives the size of the emotional response. A great example I like to use from this is playing poker. So a lot of my models are based on playing poker, incidentally. But
interesting. That's very typical of economics, actually.
Yeah. Actually, yeah. When you get into the risk side, so what I point out though is if you're playing a game of poker with friends at home for pennies, nickels, whatever, versus playing in Las Vegas for $1,000 chips, it's the same game. You don't play it the same way because the size of the risk is much higher, and really understanding how that changes the emotional side of how we play the game, how we view the decision. That's part of what we're looking at. And that's what we're also building into our cloud economics part of this as well. That's one of the great things I like about what we're driving with VMware Cloud on AWS is essentially we're looking at abstracting the cloud layer. So you're abstracting the cloud layer just the same way we abstracted the physical layer with vSphere virtualization. We're abstracting the cloud layer now, so we're kind of insulating and protecting customers against being locked into a particular cloud provider. So I think that's a great way to help mitigate and reduce that type of risk if that's significant for the customer.
I have a question back on freeze before we go too far, which is I noticed that freeze to me happens when there's not a clear differential between one solution and another solution, where I haven't got enough data, right, to be able to make a decision. And it's not necessarily analysis paralysis as much as it is nothing was compelling. Right, where the break even wasn't high enough on that third value, right? The return must be higher than, and so I tend to freeze because I go, well, nothing's really compelling. Maybe I'll wait till tomorrow or a week for tomorrow or next year to see if that value proposition changed. I wonder how that plays into that.
And I'd say really there's not really anything wrong with that because there's not a compelling driver associated with that. Some of the other factors that I look at in our risk methodology is understanding what I call risk accelerators. And those are things looking at how complex is the process of the project we're doing compared to what we've done before. Is it a similar level of complexity?
Right.
What is the time pressure to make a decision? That's one of those compelling
Right.
things
I wrote some notes down here, and time is also one of those that you tend to plug into it, which is everything is based on time, right? Or at least for me, I look and I go, do I freeze? If I freeze, how much time do I let go by before I reevaluate whether this is going to make sense? Or is there a time pressure that I need to make these decisions quicker? Then I have to now analyze the risk differently because there's time pressure on the whole thing.
Correct. And we find that time pressure tends to make us make quicker decisions. Maybe with less information than what we would ordinarily like to have.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So the example of this that always pops into my mind is, should I get gas at this gas station or should I try to find something that's a little bit cheaper, right? And that is like when you are at 3/4 of a tank full, like you're maybe hunting for a deal, right? But when you're on fumes and the desire to save like a nickel per gallon maybe it's not that great. It's really more about the huge problem is me getting stuck here and running out of gasoline, not do I want to save like $1 per fill up.
Right, because now you've added new information, new risk. You've added the risk of, do I want to have to walk 2 miles down the road carrying a gas can, or having to call AAA, or is having somebody see me walking down the road with a gas can? You've added some additional risk there to the problem, and also the mathematician in me looks at going, okay, so I'd have to know what the miles per gallon of my vehicle is and how far I have to go to save that penny on that gas to see how many miles can I go before that penny's not I'm spending more to get the penny savings than I'm gaining.
Yeah.
I think what's there's kind of a meta point to all of this. In fact, I urge our listeners take a look at Jeff Bezos' latest letter to shareholders. Actually, it was in 2015, but where he talks about there are really two kinds of decisions. There's the sort of reversible and irreversible. And so that's also kind of, if you commit to one way and you've only got 3 ounces of gas left on your car, that's kind of irreversible because the car will run out of gas. And then there's the ones where kind of reversible. So in addition to making the decisions, what is their level of reversibility? And this can sometimes mitigate the freeze decision. Now, classic Harvard Business School case was when in the mid-'80s, Intel was looking at moving. They really hadn't fully made the decision to commit to processors at that time. We think of them as the processor company, but at that point, most of their business was memory chips, but they were being undercut by Korean, Taiwanese manufacturers.
Right.
And there was about 3 years there. And at the end, Andy Grove said at the time, he said, why couldn't you guys make a decision? It's like, we didn't know what to do. There was no other. And for them, ultimately, the moving into processors was sort of irreversible. Turns out to have been a reasonably good decision. Speaking as a shareholder of Intel, is generally a pretty good move.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the 5 accelerators that I have within our model. One was I mentioned before how complex the solution is. Commitment level is the one that I was talking. Bill was just mentioning. There is how committed to this decision are we? Right. Or once we commit to it, there's no turning back? Or are there exit ramps in the process where if it's not going right, we can get off the process? And then time to implement. Right. What's the pressure to implement the solution? Time pressure to decide. And then lastly, I thought was a really good one was looking at what's the vendor or the outcome. What's the ability to actually execute on the solution? So if you're looking at a decision between vendors, what's their ability to execute?
Right. That risk. So we're down in the risk modeling, Bill. If we up-level this, what does it mean to an IT practitioner? Are you applying this to the cloud purchasing cycle? How are you taking this type of work and introducing it to our ecosystem?
So it's actually pretty interesting. So we'll talk about kind of more broadly, and then I'll hand it off to Craig. But one of the things that we try to help people do, everybody wants to know kind of dollars and cents. So we start out with a TCO model, but then it becomes, well, what are my options? What are the other options? If I go strictly cloud native, what is that cost relative both in dollars, which are useful, but also in time and risk? In other words, I may have a greater degree of ability to complete a particular course of action, or a greater sense of failure, or a greater propensity to failure in another course. So, Craig, we talk a little bit about, because you've done some really good work in terms of helping people understand where the risks are when they're looking at a choice to move to the cloud.
Yeah, so some of the areas we look at when I generally describe the process as we go through as really 4 steps. One is to identify what risk you are potentially exposed to. Understand what are the risks out there for this particular decision. Secondly is really to quantify.
I'm sorry, just to interrupt you there. Are you talking about the risk of not making the decision or the risk of making the decision?
The risk that could occur as a part of that decision.
Okay.
More broadly.
As I'm trying to choose between 2 options, I have to make a choice between stay as I am or go with solution A or solution B, so forth. So I look at some of the what are the common areas of risk. Things in our methodology, I look at things around availability. I look at governance and compliance. I look at security and privacy, business relationships. So I look at things that involve that could involve revenue. It could involve customer impact. It could involve goodwill and perception, where I go down and it's on the front page of every major newspaper. Some area there. I also look at return factors. They deal with areas like accessibility, agility, scalability, and cost and resource accounting, just to name a few. But those are some of the things that we look at from that perspective. So as I mentioned, the first thing is to identify what these risks are, because once you know what is hiding under the bed, it's not quite as scary as when you don't know what's under the bed or in the closet. So we identify those risks. Secondly, is we want to quantify it and really understand what would this event, what kind of impact would it have for this particular decision or this project or solution I'm working with. Then we want to take a look at analyzing how much risk am I willing to accept, because in every decision we should be willing to accept some degree of a risk in a decision. Now, some things that maybe it's going to cause a regulatory issue. My risk goal may be very low or none. But there may be some other areas where I'm willing to accept a little bit of risk to gain some return. So we look at that in terms of analyzing. And then the last part is to forecast, to take a look at your gut feeling. What do you feel about this particular event? What do you think the probability or likelihood of that kind of an issue happening or an event happening between solution A, choice A, or choice B? And so the methodology goes through that process and really helps you get, in a lot of ways, it helps you sort of quantify your gut feeling. And so once you find that you've taken a look, you understand you've got a better idea of what the risks are and how big they really are, it helps you come up with a better and more informed decision.
Sorry, go ahead.
We're going to arm wrestle.
Yeah.
Who wants to go?
I'm sorry.
Jonh, take it away.
I want to jump in just because it struck me what you're talking about, quantification, right? It reminds me of an article I read, or actually I think it was a book, and it was by a professional poker player, right, Annie Duke, who wrote, I think the book is called Thinking in Bets, and she advocated in making decisions that you actually have to think about what the percentage chance of each outcome is when you are assessing your choice of decisions. So when you talk about risk, you have to say, like, what is my downside risk? If we make the wrong decision, if I go with decision choice A, my downside might be $1 million, $5 million, $10 million. Now, what's the chance of that happening? Oh, 1%, 3%, 20%, right? And the different chances times the different downsides, results in different,
different outcomes.
Total outcomes, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I've found is as I've been doing more research and more development here, what I'm creating is game theory. A lot of this has got game theory built into it. And essentially the way I'm going about through the process is the min-max process in game theory. Right.
Also, I would say the relevance to an IT professional, if you're an individual contributor, if you're trying to sell upstream to your management structure and executive structure the choice of doing something, you have to understand what they see as the downside risks, the indecision risks, the exposure to doing nothing versus making a choice, and you have to actually put it in the context of the goals of the business too.
Right. And it's important to point out that the goal is not always to avoid risk. Risk should be embraced because I don't think you really ever make any progress unless you accept risk and you embrace risk. But I like to have my risk mitigated, or I like to have my risk covered. I'm not much of a gambler, even though I like the poker analogy. I don't do much betting on it unless I've kind of got the deck sort of stacked in my favor. So that's one thing I look at risk from a standpoint of understanding what the risk is and how can we mitigate that risk to a point where it's an acceptable level.
Well, and as you're presenting it to management, the better you have a case where you've thought out the risk and kind of articulate that, the more willing everybody is to accept that risk. And if it goes wrong, at least everybody understands the risk that they took.
And that's exactly what we try to do. I mean, I think your previous question, Eric, was kind of a long form of if our listeners are interested in doing this, have your sales rep or have your contact reach out to us internally, and we can talk to you about how we work through this model. We have a channel on the Code Slack site, VMC-Econ. If you've got a question for us on that public Slack channel, send it over and either work through your rep or send us a Slack, and we can kind of help you phrase this. If you're looking at moving to the cloud and you want help being able to talk to your customers about this or talk to your management about this and framing the discussion, that's actually something that we do and we can help you with.
And I want to kick back to a question I had, which is, Craig, where do we think the industry is on analyzing risks? You've been obviously in it for 10 years now, OpenStack, that.
Yeah.
What's your impression of where we are when it comes to data center risk management? Do people have processes that they're applying? One, and that's one question. And then my follow-up would be, and I'll just hit them both at the same time, is Have you seen instances where you're working with customers and they didn't have a good risk process in place, and when they put it in place and you help them understand the process around that, did they see things differently?
Okay. That's a couple of questions I'll get to. Yeah, a lot of customers, they have hope. In fact, when one of my Gartner presentations one time was hope is not a strategy.
Okay.
So hoping it won't fail or hoping there won't be a problem is not an effective strategy. Actually, I should say it is a strategy. It's not an effective strategy.
Would you say that's like 70% of the IT industry is kind of operating on the hope model, or where do we lie?
I don't know. I'd have to take another look. I'd say for the most part, I'd
50-50?
I'd say probably more than that. I'd say people recognize risk, but they don't really know exactly how to think about it.
Quantify it.
Like we know it's out there, so
right.
we take a pass at it, and it's probably, I think a lot of it's intuitive, and that's the whole point. Is a lot of people act on kind of a gut feeling, and when that gut feeling is essentially internalizing the process of thinking and evaluating risk in some way. So what I was trying to do was come up with a more quantitative way to look at it in that perspective. Now, kind of going to your other question, we actually have leveraged this model with a few customers, and it really helped them understand the risk associated with two different types of decisions. And what they really liked about it was that the way the methodology is set up between a solution A or solution B, whether it be our product or somebody else's, is the model can really go either way. It's not slanted toward one solution is better than the other solution. And so that was one comment they liked. Another comment they made about it was they saw that it really helped. It got them thinking about it. It got them really thinking about, okay, so what really would be the impact of this type of a risk event? We've enumerated what we think the common ones are.
Right.
But what impact would that have on us? How would we respond to that? How would we mitigate that risk? So it really got them thinking about the process. And I think that really is as much of the benefit as anything else in the process.
Right. That makes sense. And to Bill, on your previous episode, I asked him directly, what was the episode number again?
It was 478 on your radio dial.
Don't forget to go back and listen to 478.
That's right.
Because I hit him directly and said, well, which is it? What's the answer when we talk about going to cloud? And Bill just looked at me and said, there's no such thing as a which is it, right? There is never an answer. It's you put it through the equation, you do the analysis of your risk, and then you get an answer. Sometimes the answer is no, don't do it this way, do it this other way. It was actually a profound question that I thought Bill did really well answering, which is, cloud might or might not work for you depending on your risk and what your value props are, what you're trying to accomplish, and you actually have to look at it from an equation data perspective to get an answer. There is no right answer.
And we're lucky in that sense. Craig and I are actually, we're not in sales. We get paid whether people buy or not. Well, that's maybe not a long-term strategy, but generally...
A little more risk in that. But.
A little more risk in that. A little more risk. No, but I wanted to go back to, for those of you who want a kind of a more of a formalization, for those of you listening, another way to look at it is I was deeply influenced by fuzzy logic. And it's a branch of mathematics. A guy by the name of Latvizadeh was a Berkeley professor, go Bears. And fuzzy logic was really just broken down into probabilism. And so it was really about sometimes it's going to be, sometimes the pitch breaks right, sometimes the pitch breaks left. What's the percentage of time? How can you make your decisions?
Right. And there's this book called Blink, which was done by, I forget, some famous authors.
Malcolm Gladwell.
Malcolm Gladwell.
And they take you through 9 or 10 chapters of how your best assessment is done in the first 15 seconds because you just have a complex network in your brain that can analyze these things. And so you totally get bought into this idea that, your Blink idea is the way to go. You just have this innate ability to assess risk and do this. But then the last 3 chapters, if you manage to get through the whole book, talks about how marketing and companies can modify your Blink response to make you assess the wrong thing completely, even though your gut tells you it's completely right. That's normally the case if you're just looking at the forest and doing an analysis. But when you get into sophisticated companies that are selling you products, you actually have to go back to the data model because companies have figured out how to influence your Blink reaction.
Hacking that reaction,
And some of us have really terrible first impressions. So I never trust my Blink reaction, but that's just because I'm a cautionary tale for most people.
I'd go back to the poker analogy. I remember, there's a point in my life during the poker boom where I would actually go to California casinos and play cards in person, and there was these moments where I really felt like I could like see through the other person's cards, and I was right like a good 15% of the time. I guess what I'm saying is I was really bad at it, but I felt like I was
felt you were good at it.
really sure, had no perception.
Yeah, I was saying as I go more and more into this, I'm seeing that a lot of this is really wrapped up in basic game theory.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned the min-max. John von Neumann, I believe, is kind of
There you go.
created that idea, isn't it? And actually, that I didn't realize when I was building this out. I was kind of building it out organically. That I went back and looked at it. I was like, yeah, that's min-max. You just built.
Yeah, you just came to. Right.
You just recreated
Don't you
this.
hate that when that happens? When you think you're onto something really great,
Yeah, it's
and
already
unique
been done.
and custom,
Yeah,
and you're like, okay, got it. Right.
I also like that what you're talking about is a process, right? And it's a process which is not going to come out with the same result for each individual, for varied organizations. So varied organizations have different return on investment, different costs. Like, for example, just analyzing one thing, downtime. Cost of downtime. For one company it might be, oh my goodness, that's $100 a minute, and for another company it might be, oh my goodness, that's $1 million a minute, right? So those two companies are going to do different things to avoid downtime, right?
Yeah, in this particular methodology, going into a little more detail, it calculates something I've called inherent risk, which is the, or an imputed risk between what you're willing to tolerate and what you're being exposed to, and that's part of what factors into it. There's also some financial risk coefficients that are generated, and ultimately I end up with what I call a risk-adjusted TCO. So you take the impact of risk and the impact of these decisions, how they would impact the revenue stream or what, and we determine that based on looking at how much revenue is impacted by this particular application or system or whatever. It can be applied to a project, an application, whatever. But we're looking at what would be what's the potential revenue impact. So that's our upside bogey there. And then we look at what's the cost of doing it, the TCO. And TCO plugs in right into that. And then we start looking at the non-financial sides of the impact. The things that, even though maybe we've been given a very good and clear TCO, for example, if I come to you and tell you, hey, I've got the solution, it's exactly everything you need, I can guarantee you, and let's say you believe me, it's going to save you $10 million, no problem, you're going to save that money, it's $3 million for the software. So you're going to say, let's buy it right now.
How many can I buy?
How many can I buy? Yeah. The problem is it's still a lot of money.
Right.
But if I said that, hey, I can save you all this money, $10 million, and your investment is $1,000. Mm-hmm. Well, now you're going to say, yeah, do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so what just happened there? The decision point was changed because of the size of the size of it, the size of the investment. And that's where we kind of look at, there's another economic example story they give where, if I told you in terms of probability, if I said, okay, I can give you $1 right now, so you can have $1, or we can flip a coin for $10. Which one would you go for?
Well, I'd flip the coin. That's 50% of $10 is $5.
Right, exactly. But what if I add 6 zeros and say, I'll give you $1 million, or we'll flip a coin for $10 million?
Ah, I see. So this is the perception of the sure thing compared to like how much value it had,
or the
right?
risk
It's
of losing.
no more sure. It's no more
what's the-
sure
what's
at
the pain of
at
losing?
$1. It's the size. Yeah, now
So it's
you're
a
looking at the
psychological
size of the loss.
Right.
And that's one of the things I was looking at. I think that as humans, we tend to be wired from a loss prevention perspective, a loss prevention mindset.
Right.
So and it becomes apparent when you start adding zeros to a number. We suddenly now become more focused on the loss than the win, and preserving the loss.
That comes back to my freeze assessment, right? Which is I'm frozen once that number gets beyond my tolerable loss perspective. It doesn't matter. I can't afford to lose the $1 million, even if the upside is $5 million and everybody sees that upside.
Right.
I just can't tolerate. And rightfully so. Companies can't tolerate. It'll put you out of business before you ever realize if that one happens.
You're not alone.
Right. Yeah.
There's not many of us that would say, yeah, unless we feel like we're really lucky people. Mm-hmm. There are not a whole lot of people would say, yeah, I'll flip for the $5 million.
So
I'll walk away from $1 million.
This goes back to another poker analogy or gambling thing, right? Which is like the risk and the upside versus total bankroll. Right. So if my total bankroll is $40 billion and you're talking about flipping a coin for $10 billion, then, the size of this upside downside risk versus like my net worth, which is not $40 billion, by the way. But versus if my total net worth is $40, like it's a different proportion.
Right.
That's your third, by the way, sort of poker mention. So let me just say, get help.
I'm sorry. I think I kind of enabled him earlier on. So
You enabler. You.
So bumping back up again, I miss the days of P to V because it was just such an easy explanation where you went physical to virtual was a 20 to 1 if you're lucky, maybe 12 to 1 if you were unlucky, or 10 to 1 consolidation ratio. So it was easy to look and showcase that risk. When you start talking about cloud, it's not that easy, but it seems like there's use cases in this that would be easy. Like where I come back to high availability. Crash. What do we call it when the site goes down? Site recovery manager.
Oh yeah, right.
Where
Disaster recovery.
Disaster recovery, where the risk is low because I don't really have site recovery, so I can add capacity in cloud, and therefore there's not really much of a loss here. So it's a no-brainer from a risk assessment perspective. And then we climb up the stack for different use cases. So do you guys have different use case models that the risk applies to when you're talking to customers? So disaster recovery is an easy win, right? Versus some managing workloads, dynamic management of workloads, network. Do you frame these risk managements into buckets?
I'd say within the methodology, it's really designed so it can be adapted to any workload or use case. Because you specifically, as I mentioned, we've got the risk, what we consider the risk elements identified, but then you look at each one and determine, so what is how do I quantify this? How important is this particular problem to this particular application? So it actually is configurable to a specific workload or a specific use case.
And what
each
are
one
those
can have a
questions?
different
You had
risk.
a couple of questions there, like how important is this to you, and what are a couple of those, just so that folks can get a handle on.
Well, some of the questions we look at, for example, like say if you have an outage that involves, let's say, governance and compliance. So let's say I have an outage. So how does this affect me from a legal and regulatory standpoint? So I look at that. So I've got my application is the Super Agile app. Okay, it's a great little app we're putting out there. Does helps you play poker better. So I've got the Super Agile app. I've got legal and regulatory. So if I had an outage, or an issue or a problem occurred, this particular problem, how would I evaluate that from a legal and regulatory? Okay, maybe that's not a big aspect to me. Another one's maybe geopolitical. Do I need this information? Do I have to have it available across geo regions, or am I restricted to a particular geo region? I can't have my data going some other place. Others maybe standards compliance. Looking from availability, how does this impact employee productivity? Okay, if I was to have a failure between choosing, a cloud native solution or an AWS VMC AWS solution. How would it affect if it took down my employees? Okay, how big of a problem would that be, and how much outage am I willing to accept? And then what do I think the likelihood is between the choices? That's generally how we go through it. We also look at from the standpoint of the customer. So how does this affect my customer? If I'm running an online banking app and my banking app goes down, for whatever reason, let's say a site becomes available, host becomes unavailable. Is that a good risk or a bad risk for me? So am I willing to tolerate any risk in that? Most people say no risk on that one. So you can go through that process, but we look at revenue, we look at legal and regulatory, we look at a lot of different areas to try to enumerate again what these risks are that you could potentially be exposed to. Now, is it every possible risk? No, because I don't think you can kind of pick everything, but we can come up with the common ones we think are going to be the most likely.
The families of risk that usually. Hey, what's interesting also about, I think, psychology is that we have these blind spots, right, in
Yes.
risk that,
What you don't know, you don't know.
Yeah, and sometimes they're active blind spots. I really am actively trying to avoid thinking
It's
about.
like, no, didn't see that. Nope.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the other methodologies we're working with, we're looking at is blind spots. As we're talking about looking at cloud solutions, if we're looking at going, cloud native versus a solution like we have with VMC, what are the blind spots in that type of decision? And part of that is looking at, first of all, the costs associated with the other choice. if we're going to be in a situation where we have to refactor and rewrite applications, that's time and money. It's going to take some time to do that. It's going to take a lot of money to do that. And then there's another blind spot in terms of time and training. So we've got training that has to go through. We have staff that is not going to be initially as productive. So we're adding more time again to the process. So we go through this whole process to get to this end state of cloud native applications. And as soon as we start using integrated APIs and services on that platform, the more we use, the more we start becoming locked in to that. So then we look at the risk level in terms of how do you feel about being locked in? Is that really something that concerns the customer? How do they feel about the lock-in, and do they see that as a potential problem? Another thing we take a look at is what's your appetite for refactoring again,
that's
in 3 to 5 years.
That's the real lock-in cost there.
Exactly. So a couple things. First of all, how difficult would it be to refactor again if you decide you're going to move to a different cloud provider or a different, or maybe you want to come back on-prem. Maybe the cloud service, we've heard of some situations where the cloud solution didn't work out. Refactoring had to happen again to move back on-premise. So what's the appetite for that? And then also, more importantly, is what's the executive level support? What do you think the executive level support would be for refactoring again? That may be high. Depends on what the app is and who the organization is. And then lastly, I think is one we haven't really gotten into here too much, but I think is very important, is looking at what's your level of integration between Edge and IoT. And how does that fit within your cloud architecture? And I think that's very important to understand, because if you get locked into a platform that's not really going to support an integrated or an ecosystem that will help drive and support your Edge and IoT, again, you're locking yourself out of opportunities, as you mentioned earlier.
So exposure to disruptive technology, or even access to disruptive technology.
Well, correct. Well, you may have access to it, but again, what we're looking for is a unified ecosystem to be able to manage that. I mean, it's not so much of putting IoT and edge devices out there. I mean, we've got Raspberries everywhere. I've got Raspberry running a cloud system. I mean, you can do all kinds of really cool things or things like that. The thing is, though, how do you start managing these tens, hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of edge and computing devices? How do you bring those in? How do you manage those?
Yeah, that's interesting. How do you guys plug into cloud architecture in general, right? Because I think a lot of this comes into the cloud architectural conversation. How are we laying out the next generation cloud architecture? How much of it is going to be cloud native applications? Do you guys plug into those conversations?
I think we do to a degree, because we look at, every situation is different where we work with a customer. I'm working with one customer where they're talking about they're targeting a 50-50 between cloud native and either on-prem or a generalized cloud service like VMC. So I think it depends on the company, it depends on the organization. But I don't know that a lot of your newer organizations, your startups, they're born in the cloud. Cloud first, cloud native applications, and that's great because that's the way they're building from the standpoint from the startup. But then we've got a lot of companies that have a lot of legacy. We mentioned mainframes. I think there is still, I don't know what's the number, how many million lines of COBOL there's still
running,
still out there. So there's a lot of these legacy systems that still have to be dealt with, and maybe converting, rewriting, going through a refactoring to rewrite that code to work on cloud native is not effective or efficient. Talking with one SE, he was talking about one system that it was actually millions of lines of code they would have to look at adapting to go to a cloud native solution. So in that sort of situation, we've already made the transition from physical to virtual through virtualizing the hardware. So we abstracted the hardware. And, like I was saying, the next layer, I think, is abstracting the cloud provider layer. So that now your workloads can move around to whatever cloud provider we want to run it at.
There is a question in the chat, so I'll just ask it because it's there. They're talking about the idea that when they would go in and present an architecture to the IT guys, they got one level of risk assessment. When they went to the VP of engineering or the higher level up, they got a different assessment of risk, right? Do you guys deal with that? Do you see that? And how would you advise somebody to handle the different levels of perceived risk in the organization?
So that's key. You have to understand who you're presenting to, and that's frequently the case. We've got one customer we've been working with recently where I think we talked to 3 separate groups, and it really seemed like 3 separate agendas. And so that is a challenge. And I think the key is to try and understand what level the decision gets made at and decide kind of what is important to them. What is driving this person? How are they motivated? Is this something, they're a VP and they want to be a senior VP? Okay, how do they get there? How does this apply? What does that work?
And that's the personal side of the emotional side of the decision. And and how everyone responds to risk is personal. It's different for every person.
Now, some people are more like, hey, look, I got to cut 3% off in most IT groups. I've got to cut 3% off my ongoing budget. Okay, so does this help them get to that? Couch it in those terms. So we find frequently, especially in large deals as that we model out as we work with customers, each additional group will require a different model. One particular customer ended up doing 13 different models because of the various iterations. And so my advice to you is make sure you understand your audience. And if at all possible, and I realize if a VP is 3 levels above you, you can't just say, hey, Bob, what are your kind of key things going on there? You want to do your best to try and understand kind of the customer. I'm not saying spin, but I think you need to take the value that you're delivering it and make sure it fits within the way they look at things.
That's right, and you can imagine that, like if you're an individual contributor in an IT organization, you can ask your manager how they think about what successful projects look like, and then you can ask your manager what their director thinks that looks like, and then and so on.
And also, you may have champions that you can talk to that know what the thinking is. You've also got past performance. If they've gotten involved in a project in the past that was supposed to work out great and it was a disaster, it kind of gives you some hints as to what the tender points might be in the risk.
All right, up-leveling a little bit. We have 5 minutes left. The hour just flies by, as always, with Mr. Roth and Craig. Good to have you here. I have one suggestion for you guys. I see an O'Reilly book in your future, right? It would be fun to have a book that took you through cloud economics and took you through, like, here's some kind of notes on how to look at this and how to do this, because I haven't seen anything that would help me understand and go through. I want just the answer. I want just the cliff notes of here, apply this for high availability.
Risk
apply
for dummies.
This. Yeah. Don't ever mention dummies on this show, ever, because nobody's dumb here. But I would say that an O'Reilly book that actually took me through, how to look at my situation and plug things in. I almost want the QuickBooks at the end of when I do my taxes,
right,
where it kind of gives me the needle and just goes, and tells me, I'm in the green, but just a little bit yellow. And then gives me suggestions based on the data I've given it, what I should be doing and where. So when it comes to high availability or disaster recovery, I'm in green. This is easy an assessment for me. When we start talking cloud native apps, how many lines of code do I have? Plug this in, and it gives me a red going, you need to worry about these 7 things. I think there's something interesting here.
Well, if anyone knows, it used to be Mike Lukides. If anybody out there knows the acquisitions editor at O'Reilly, get in touch with us. I know most of the book is just written. We just need to type it in. It's all in the head.
Yeah,
so.
I think we're gonna push for that. I think this would be a great book.
No, I know how this works. You need to write a series of blog posts and then self-publish.
Funny you should mention that.
Exactly. Isn't that how one does a PhD these days? Anyway.
Right. So we're at the top of the hour. I always talk. We got 3 minutes left. Where are you guys? Are you going to be at VMworld? Did you submit a session? Are we going to be talking economics and risk assessment during VMworld?
We are working on it right now. We're working on having content.
Your fingers crossed.
We are proposing a meet an economist. Craig and I will do our best to be there in our bow ties and our jackets with the suede patches.
It's in San Francisco this year. We can certainly sneak you under the big tent and let you crawl under the bleachers and get
Indeed.
a spot somewhere. Right? It's
Our
not
plan
gonna
is to
that
be
hard.
able to have our calendars out, and if you want to sit down and go through a TCO model with us, sign up ahead of time, and we'll sit down and kind of work through your situation.
That sounds great. That sounds great. All right. So Craig Stanley, VMware's lead cloud economist, thanks for joining us. Bill Roth, director of cloud economics, thanks again for being here. It's a good show, and we'll transition now to the barbecue report. Which, Craig, I hear you got something, but first I'll go to Tony Foster. Tony, what you got going this weekend for barbecue?
So this week I actually barbecued pork ribs. Nothing fancy, but they were really, really good. They were nice and thick. And
Did you
meat just
dry
fell
rub
off the
them?
bone.
Did you go saucy? How did you do it?
I'm from Kansas, so of course I went with sauce.
Nice.
Just out of the bottle sauce. I didn't make my own, but they were
Nice.
still really good.
Very good, very good. And I hear Craig did some pork too. Why don't you tell us?
Yeah, I did some pork butts for Memorial Day. So my method is I use one of these pellet grills, which is fantastic because it allows me to set the temperature. So I took a couple of pork butts. I always do a couple of them because they take some time. Usually mix up about half a cup of honey, half a cup of molasses, and a couple of tablespoons of Dijon mustard. Coat the meat with it liberally and then apply the rubs. Put it in the smoker at 225. Close it up and don't open it for about 14 to 18 hours, depending on the size of the meat. When it hits 195, I take it out, let it rest wrap it up in foil and blankets, and let it rest for 2 hours, and it just falls apart. You got about a half an inch smoke ring, nice black bark on the meat. It's awesome.
That's
You don't
awesome.
even need sauce on it.
We've got a farmer's market over at California
That
Avenue.
sounds wonderful.
And they do the similar thing where they do it 2 days ahead of time, and then they bring it to a booth, and then they throw that up on a hot grill and char it on the warm it up, give it a little char on the top. Oh yeah, that stuff is amazing.
It just pulls apart.
Yeah.
The bone just slides out.
Right.
Wow.
Awesome. Well, that's it for the show. It is time for lunch. We're all going to go get some lunch, I'm sure, because I am now hungry. Bill, Craig, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And say goodbye to everybody on Facebook. Thanks a lot. See
Thanks,
you guys,
everybody.
and we'll be back again next week. Until then, have a great week. Talk to you soon.